He laughed at the village elder's warning, but his journey turned deadly. Long ago, in a verdant valley bordered by rolling hills and dense forests, there lay the village of Umuntu. The villagers lived simple lives, guided by the wisdom of their elders, who shared tales and warnings passed down through generations. Among the elders was Nuru, whose snowy beard and piercing eyes seemed to hold the world's secrets. His voice, steady and measured, carried the weight of countless stories, and his presence was a pillar of strength for the community. One bright morning, a young man named Kofi stood before the village square. Known for his boundless energy and insatiable curiosity, Kofi was often the first to challenge traditions and question authority. His laugh was loud and infectious, his smile ever present, but his youthful arrogance sometimes blinded him to the wisdom of those who had walked the earth far longer. That day, he announced his intention to journey beyond the valley into the forbidden forest, a place steeped in mystery and fear. "The forbidden forest is just trees and shadows," Kofi declared, his voice brimming with confidence. His words echoed in the square, drawing the attention of farmers, weavers, and children who paused their tasks to listen. "I will prove to everyone that there is no reason to fear it. We have allowed old tales to shackle us for too long." The villagers gasped, murmuring among themselves with increasing intensity. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer, as if the mere mention of the forbidden forest could summon its dangers into their midst. Farmers set down their tools, and weavers abandoned their looms, all drawn to the unfolding scene in the village square. The air seemed to grow heavier, laden with a tension that seeped into the hearts of all present. Nuru, the eldest and wisest among them, observed the commotion from the shaded veranda of his hut. His sharp eyes, though weathered with age, caught every detail of Kofi's brash stance and the worried faces of the onlookers. With deliberate purpose, Nuru rose, gripping his ornately carved staff, a symbol of his years and the wisdom they had granted him. Each step he took echoed on the cobbled path, the rhythmic tap of his staff cutting through the murmurs like a bell tolling in the distance. As he approached, villagers instinctively stepped aside, forming a wide path. Some bowed their heads in respect, others clasped their hands together as if in silent prayer. The chatter gradually died away, replaced by an almost sacred hush that fell over the square. Nuru's presence was magnetic. His frame, though stooped with age, exuded an authority that commanded reverence. His long robe, dyed in earthy tones, seemed to sway in harmony with the gentle breeze, while the intricate beadwork adorning his collar glimmered faintly in the sunlight. His eyes, dark and knowing, scanned the crowd before settling on Kofi, who stood defiantly, arms crossed and chin lifted high. The elder stopped a few paces from Kofi, his expression inscrutable. He studied the young man for a moment, his silence more powerful than any words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, yet it carried an undeniable weight that resonated deep within every listener. "Kofi, my son," Nuru began, his tone imbued with both sorrow and caution. "You are young, and your heart is full of courage, but courage without wisdom can lead to ruin. The forbidden forest is not as it seems. Its beauty hides dangers that even the bravest cannot comprehend. Many have entered its depths, their minds filled with curiosity and pride, only to be consumed by what they did not understand." The villagers shifted uneasily, some nodding in agreement while others murmured prayers under their breath. Nuru raised his staff slightly, a signal for silence, and the crowd obeyed instantly. He took a step closer to Kofi, his piercing gaze locking onto the young man's defiant eyes. "It is said," Nuru continued, "that the spirits of the forest guard its secrets fiercely. They do not tolerate arrogance, nor do they suffer fools lightly. The forest is alive, Kofi. It listens, it watches, and it remembers. To enter it with disrespect is to invite its wrath. My child, do not mistake your strength for invincibility. Heed my warning and stay within the safety of our valley." The crowd held its collective breath, their eyes darting between the elder and the young man. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Kofi's face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He straightened his posture, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Elder, I respect you," Kofi said, his tone firm but not unkind. "But your stories belong to an age long past. The world has changed, and we must change with it. I am not afraid of shadows or spirits. I will return with proof that your fears are unfounded, and then perhaps we can lay these old tales to rest." A ripple of unease swept through the crowd. Some villagers gasped aloud, while others shook their heads in disapproval. A few whispered anxiously among themselves, their voices barely audible over the oppressive tension that gripped the square. Nuru, however, did not react with anger or frustration. Instead, his expression softened, and a deep sadness clouded his eyes. Kofi," he said softly, almost to himself. "You have the heart of a lion, but even a lion knows when to tread carefully. Your path is your own, but remember my words. The forest is not a place for pride." With that, Nuru turned away, his staff tapping against the ground as he retreated into the crowd. The villagers parted once more to let him through, their faces a mixture of awe and apprehension. Kofi remained standing in the center of the square, his resolve unshaken, though a small voice of doubt began to whisper in the back of his mind. But he silenced it quickly, dismissing the elder's warnings as the product of a superstitious past. As the crowd dispersed, mothers clutched their children tightly, whispering warnings about the dangers of defiance. Older men shook their heads, muttering about the arrogance of youth, while others simply looked toward the forest with fear and reverence. All the while, Nuru sat quietly on his veranda, watching the fading sun, and wondering if the spirits of the forbidden forest would show mercy to one so bold. "Kofi, my son," Nuru said, his voice grave and tinged with sorrow. "The forest is not as it seems. Many have entered and never returned. It is said that spirits guard its secrets, testing those who dare to trespass. The forest is alive, and it does not take kindly to arrogance. Heed my warning. Stay within the safety of our valley." But Kofi only laughed. "Elder, I respect you, but your stories belong to an age-long past. I am not afraid of shadows or spirits. I will return with proof that your fears are unfounded." Despite the elder's heartfelt pleas, Kofi set out at the break of dawn. The sky was a soft gradient of orange and pink, the first light of day illuminating the valley. He carried a modest pack filled with provisions, dried fruits, nuts, and a small flask of water along with a knife that he had sharpened the night before. His heart was brimming with determination, his stride confident as he made his way toward the edge of the forbidden forest. To Kofi, this was not merely a journey. It was a challenge, an opportunity to prove himself not just to the villagers, but to the spirits of the forest themselves, if they indeed existed. The village gathered silently to watch him leave, their expressions a mixture of worry and resignation. Mothers clutched their children tightly, their lips moving in whispered prayers for his safety. Fathers shook their heads in disapproval, muttering under their breath about the arrogance of youth. The elderly exchanged knowing glances, their weathered faces betraying the weight of similar stories from the past, tales that had not ended well. Kofi's closest friends stood a little apart from the crowd, their eyes full of unspoken fear. One of them, a girl named Ama, who had grown up alongside him, stepped forward. "Kofi," she called out, her voice breaking slightly, "you don't have to do this. Please listen to Elder Nuru. The forest, it's not just stories. People don't return." But Kofi simply flashed her his characteristic grin, his confidence unshaken. "Amma," he replied, "you worry too much. I'll be back before sunset with proof that these tales are just that, tales. And when I return, we'll have a great feast to celebrate." His tone was light, but there was a flicker of something beneath his bravado, perhaps a shadow of doubt, that even he wasn't ready to acknowledge. At the edge of the village, Elder Nuru stood motionless, his staff planted firmly in the ground. He had watched countless sunrises in his long life, but this one felt different, heavy with foreboding. His piercing eyes followed Kofi's figure as it grew smaller, swallowed by the dense greenery of the forest. The elder's heart was heavy, not just with the sorrow of watching a young man ignore his warning, but with the certainty of what awaited Kofi beyond the trees. "Spirits guide him," Nuru murmured, his voice barely audible, yet it carried the weight of a prayer. The villagers lingered long after Kofi had disappeared into the thicket. Some bowed their heads in silence, others shook their heads and returned to their tasks, muttering about the foolishness of the young. Yet a few remained at the forest's edge, their eyes fixed on the dense wall of trees, hoping against hope to catch a glimpse of Kofi's return. At first, the forest seemed almost welcoming. The morning sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirped melodiously, their songs weaving an intricate symphony with the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Kofi took this as a sign of affirmation, his confidence swelling. He marveled at the towering trees, their trunks wrapped in emerald moss, and the wild flowers that dotted the underbrush, their vibrant colors adding to the illusion of peace. "See," he muttered to himself, his voice cutting through the ambient sounds of the forest. "Just trees and shadows. Nothing to fear." He hummed a tune, his steps light, as if to mock the grave warnings of the elder and the villagers. But as he ventured deeper, the forest began to change. The sunlight grew dim, as if the canopy had thickened, sealing him off from the world outside. The once cheerful songs of the birds fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. The air grew colder, carrying with it an unsettling scent of decay. The path, once clear, now twisted and turned unpredictably, the undergrowth thickening as if to entangle his steps. Kofi paused, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. He glanced over his shoulder, but the way he had come was no longer visible. The trees loomed closer, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches forming grotesque shapes against the darkening sky. "It's just a forest," he told himself, his voice louder this time, as if to banish the growing unease. But his words felt hollow, the silence swallowing them as soon as they were spoken. The journey that had started with such promise now felt oppressive. Kofi's steps faltered, his breath quickening. He reached into his pack for his flask, only to find his hands trembling as he uncorked it. The water felt cool against his parched throat, but it did little to soothe the growing knot of anxiety in his chest. In the distance, a faint sound broke the silence. It was neither the chirping of birds nor the rustling of leaves, but a low, almost imperceptible hum. It grew louder with each passing moment, resonating in his ears like the drumming of an unseen force. Kofi froze, his senses heightened, his eyes darting around the darkening forest. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally, as if the forest itself was mocking him. There was no answer, only the hum that now seemed to come from every direction. Kofi's pulse quickened. He gripped his knife tightly, his earlier bravado entirely replaced by a primal instinct to survive. For the first time, Nuru's words echoed in his mind with chilling clarity. The forest listens. It watches, and it remembers. As he stood there, the hum ceased abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. And in that silence, Kofi felt it a presence, unseen but undeniable. watching him with a malevolent intensity. He took a hesitant step forward, his foot crunching on a dry twig, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness. He was no longer alone. At first, the forest seemed harmless. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Birds chirped melodiously, and a gentle breeze whispered through the leaves. Kofi marveled at the towering trees, their trunks covered in moss and their branches intertwined like an ancient tapestry. His confidence grew with each step, and he began to hum a tune, his spirits high. But as the day waned, the forest began to change. The air grew heavy, and an eerie silence replaced the cheerful birdsong. Shadows lengthened, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to dance in the corner of his vision. The path became less distinct, as if the forest itself sought to confuse him. Kofi felt eyes upon him, though he saw no one. Still, he pressed on, dismissing his unease as mere imagination. As night fell, Kofi stumbled upon a clearing where an ancient tree stood, its gnarled branches stretching skyward like skeletal arms frozen in supplication. The tree's bark was dark and cracked, resembling the skin of a long-forgotten giant. At its base lay a pile of stones, arranged in an unsettling, deliberate pattern that seemed almost ceremonial. Kofi hesitated as he approached, a chill running down his spine, though the air around him was still. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken presence, as though the clearing itself had been waiting for him. Despite his unease, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His legs trembled from the day's journey, and his thoughts were muddled with fatigue. Dismissing the eerie feeling as mere imagination, he decided to rest under the tree, reasoning that its massive trunk would provide shelter from the night's chill. He dropped his pack onto the ground with a dull thud, the sound seeming louder than it should have in the oppressive silence of the forest. The clearing was eerily quiet. Even the usual nocturnal symphony of crickets and rustling leaves was absent. Kofi couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, though when he turned to scan the darkened woods, he saw nothing but shadows dancing in the moonlight. Setting up a small fire, Kofi focused on the comforting crackle of the flames as they licked the dry wood. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out a modest meal of dried fruits and nuts, and ate slowly, his eyes flicking constantly to the encircling darkness. The firelight threw flickering patterns across the stones at the base of the tree, and Kofi couldn't help but notice how their arrangement seemed almost purposeful, like a marker for something forgotten or forbidden. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks, yet the feeling of unease refused to leave him. As the fire burned brighter, its light cast long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of the clearing. Kofi stared into the flames, seeking solace in their warmth, but his thoughts were drawn inexorably back to Nuru's warning. The elder's grave voice echoed in his mind. The forest is alive. It listens, it watches, and it remembers. Kofi had laughed then, dismissing the elder's words as superstition. But now those words carried a weight he could no longer ignore. For the first time since entering the forbidden forest, doubt seeped into his heart, a cold and insidious whisper that refused to be silenced. He shook his head, trying to banish the growing fear. "It's just a forest," he muttered aloud, his voice breaking the heavy silence. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that surrounded him. Kofi's bravado, which had carried him so far, now seemed like a fragile facade, threatening to crack under the weight of the unknown. The night deepened, the moon climbing higher in the sky, casting its pale light over the clearing. Kofi wrapped his cloak tightly around himself, but the chill that crept into his bones felt otherworldly, as if the forest itself was leeching the warmth from his body. He lay down near the fire, his knife close at hand, and tried to will himself to sleep. But his rest was fitful. his dreams plagued by visions of shadowy figures and glowing eyes, their whispers unintelligible but filled with menace. In the dead of night, Kofi was startled awake by a sound that sent ice through his veins, a low, guttural growl emanating from the darkness beyond the firelight. His eyes darted around the clearing, but the flickering flames revealed nothing beyond the shifting shadows. The growl came again, this time closer, vibrating through the air like a warning. Kofi's hand gripped the hilt of his knife, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it would betray his location. The fire sputtered, casting brief bursts of light that only deepened the surrounding darkness. Kofi stood, his legs unsteady, as he peered into the void. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound commanding. The growl stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying. Kofi's breathing quickened as he realized he was not alone. The clearing, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, the ancient tree looming over him like a sentinel bearing silent witness to his fear. The stones at the tree's base seemed to shimmer in the firelight, their arrangement now appearing almost glyphic, as though they held a forgotten meaning. Kofi felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to leave the clearing, to run as far as his legs could carry him. But his body refused to move, rooted to the spot by a force he could not explain. The shadows around him seemed to deepen, encroaching upon the firelight, until even the flames felt feeble against the suffocating darkness. And then, from the heart of the shadows, something moved. The moon rose high, casting a ghostly light over the clearing. Kofi stared into the flames, his mind wandering to Nuru's warning. For the first time, doubt crept into his thoughts. What if the elder had been right? What if the forest truly was cursed? He shook his head, refusing to let fear take hold. "It's just a forest," he muttered to himself. Nothing more. In the stillness of the night, Kofi was awakened by a low, guttural growl. His heart raced as he scanned the darkness, his torch casting flickering light. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike any he had ever seen, a massive, spectral beast with glowing eyes and a body that seemed to shimmer like mist. Its presence was both terrifying and mesmerizing, its form shifting as though it were not bound by the laws of this world. "Who dares disturb my domain?" The creature's voice rumbled, reverberating through the clearing. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the air with its ominous weight. Terrified but defiant, Kofi stood his ground. "I am Kofi of Umtu. I come seeking the truth of this forest. I mean no harm." His voice wavered, betraying his fear, but he refused to back down. The creature laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Kofi's spine. "Truth?" it sneered. "The truth is not for the unworthy. You mocked the wisdom of your elder and entered without respect. Now you must face the consequences." Before Kofi could respond, the beast lunged. He fled, his torch extinguished in the chaos. Branches clawed at his skin, and roots seemed to rise to trip him. The forest was alive, twisting and shifting to block his escape. Panic consumed him as he realized the elder's warning was not mere superstition. The forest was no ordinary place. It was a realm of spirits and tests, a place where arrogance was punished and humility was demanded. By dawn, Kofi stumbled out of the forest, battered and trembling. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his eyes wide with the terror of what he had endured. The villagers rushed to him, their relief mingled with shock at his disheveled state. Nuru approached, his eyes filled with both sorrow and understanding. "You have seen what lies beyond," Nuru said softly. "The forest is a test of humility and respect. Those who enter with arrogance are taught harsh lessons." Kofi fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Forgive me, Elder. I was blind to your wisdom. I thought myself above the warnings of the past." Nuru placed a hand on Kofi's shoulder, his expression gentle but firm. You have paid a heavy price for your lesson, but have returned. That is more than many can say. Remember what you have learned and let it guide you. From that day forward, Kofi became a changed man. He listened intently to the elders' stories, no longer dismissing them as folklore. He shared his own tale with the villagers, describing the forest's horrors in vivid detail. Though he never spoke of the spectral beast again, the haunted look in his eyes served as a lasting warning to all who dared to laugh at the wisdom of the village elder. The story of Kofi and the Forbidden Forest spread far beyond Umuntu, becoming a cautionary tale for other villages. Travelers and adventurers who heard the tale thought twice before entering unknown realms. And in the quiet corners of Umuntu, when the firelight flickered and the elders began their stories, even the youngest children listened with reverence, for they knew that the tales held truths deeper than the eye could see.